Radio Somerset.
Now, it's a very old saying, isn't it? Everyone's heard it. Laughter is the best medicine. And we sort of say it going, well, but sometimes actual medicine really does help. Eating disorders and stand-up comedy, though, aren't necessarily things you'd expect to find side by side. A plan is afoot, though, to get it prescribed on the NHS, training people who suffer from things like anorexia and bulimia, training them to be stand-up comics. The courses are led by Dave Chawner, who uses his own experience to be able to help others. It's called Comedy for Coping. Dave, good morning.
Good morning, Vicky. How are you?
I'm very well, and how are you, more importantly?
Very good. It's lovely and sunny here, so I'm very happy and very excited to be on the show.
Well, and it's so lovely to have you here. The idea, to me, of standing on stage and having to try and entertain people, even raise a slight chuckle for them, actually would fill me with dread.
I think it's one of those things I've always said I've got no dignity to lose, but I think it's quite surprising how many people have it on their bucket list to just give it a go. And I'm an honest, firm believer that if you have the volition, if you want to, anybody can be trained to do stand-up comedy, and actually the skills that you learn are really useful.
So if we go back to you developed an eating disorder as a teenager, and it took you a little while to realise. I mean, it's not sort of one of those things where, like you get a rash and you go, oh, look at that rash, and you suddenly notice you have it. It's one of those things that sort of over time, I suppose, is an awareness.
Absolutely. It's kind of like eyesight, in the same way that sometimes you don't realise that your eyes are going a little bit long-sighted, and it's when you're at the train station waiting for the bus or maybe driving, oh, things are a little bit odd. And that was kind of what my mental illness was like. It took a while to develop, but the problem is the term anorexic just seems so dramatic and so out there and sensationalistic, and all of the stories that I'd ever heard about were the really extreme ones. But actually, eating disorders aren't about numbers on a scale or numbers around a waist. It's about the impact on that person. And we know that, for example, 80% of people with bulimia have a mid-range BMI. And I think with the current narrative, we're leaving a lot of people behind, including people with binge eating disorder.
Yeah, and that is terrifying, actually. The sort of 80% who have this really, really serious thing, you'd look at them and you wouldn't necessarily know it.
Absolutely. I'm still really insecure, even though I was diagnosed as severely clinically anorexic and had to have fast-track treatment under the care of the Moorsley Hospital in South London, and was there for 2.5 years. I still feel really insecure that I never tell people my weight because I want to be helpful rather than a hindrance, but I never feel that it was low enough. And underneath all of that, I kind of find the term eating disorder quite ironic, because it wasn't really to do with the food at all. That was just the outlet. To me, it was a way of trying to manage with stuff that life had. And it also gave me, I'm not going to lie, and it's not a comfortable thing to say, it gave me a little bit of a buzz. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge, because it's something that people feel guilty about. In the same way that substance abuse gives people a short-term buzz, it actually leads to a much longer detrimental effect, which is why it's so damaging.
Well, it's all about control, isn't it? In a world where you have all sorts of stuff going on around you, what you can control is what you put into your own body. Obviously, that's slightly stepping aside from any sort of addiction in terms of drugs and things like that, which is almost sort of a loss of control, really, and an addiction. But this is about you being able to stop yourself from doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. But addiction itself is still a diagnosable mental illness. It's in the DSM-5, which is like basically the dictionary of mental illnesses. But for me, it was something that kind of grew subliminally. I was a teenager. I got exams. I got coursework. I got all of those normal things that people had around that time. But I didn't have a coping mechanism. And that's where the anorexia came in. And it took me a while to get better, because actually people kept on talking about taking the anorexia away. No one talked about giving anything back, which is where this comedy course comes in, to give something back and to get people associating recovery with fun rather than losing their control.
So which came first? The kind of most comics, when you speak to them, they'll have been the class joker. Which came first, the being funny Dave, or the or the anorexia?
That's a really good question. I actually think I never really thought I was a class clown. I never really thought that I was a very interesting kid. I was never sporty. I was never geeky. I was never into anything or good at sports. And actually the anorexia became my identity label. It became the thing that gave me something to be. So I suppose it might have even been the anorexia. But I always tried to joke around with it, because one of the things that I found most isolating about mental illness was my mates stopped playing pranks on me. They stopped mucking about. They stopped telling me jokes, because they were wonderful and really emotionally intelligent, and they didn't want to say the wrong thing. But in a weird way, that was more isolating than anything else, because people were treating me like something fragile that might break at any point, which is why I think comedy is such a brilliant leveler to actually get people engaged in that conversation in a sensitive but also down-to-earth way.
So in a way, actually, I suppose, you getting on stage is your way of dealing with it as well.
Oh, absolutely. So I actually started writing the show about the anorexia when I was in treatment. It was a very odd situation. And actually, when I completed my therapy, they always weigh you at the end. And my therapist popped me on the scales, and she looked at the numbers, looked at me, and she said, well, I don't really know how to tell you this, but you're now technically overweight. Is that good? But I don't know. And it was a very odd, surreal experience to know that I was overweight, yet doing a show about how I had anorexia.
But BMIs are just such a obscure way to do anything, aren't they?
Absolutely. It doesn't take into account ethnicity, gender, age, etc. And that's why it's quite an outdated mode.
Yeah. Is it quite freeing being able just to talk about it and to sort of be encouraging people to make jokes about it, about something that, like you say, so many people would, right, well, now it's time to be ever so serious.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because actually a lot of the time in life, we try to fit in. We try to hide our flaws or the things that make us different. But stand-up is all about standing out, celebrating your flaws and seeing them for good and seeing what they give you. And I say this with honest love in my heart, stand-up's full of freaks. And I love that. The people, the misfits, the people that look weird, that act weird, that think weird. And that's exactly what the cause is trying to do. Instead of trying to fit people into a societal mold, celebrating that difference and the things that might set you aside.
Do you think there's anything in we sort of talked about the control of what you put into your body, but then the accepting that with stand-up you have absolutely zero control over anything. It is not a safe thing to do, to make yourself so exposed by standing on the stage. You don't know how it's going to go, and just to have that acceptance would maybe help with other things as well.
Absolutely. And I think once you've dealt with that, then I think it does give you a sort of robustness, a self-confidence. And literally, you're providing a platform for people to stand up for themselves. But with comedy, actually, you have a lot more control than people think. The odds are stacked in your favor. You have the microphone, you have the lights that are all positioned on you, and generally, the audience want it to work. I don't think many people go out on a night out in order to have a bad night. Most people are there to enjoy it.
Yeah, you'd have to have a really weird kind of psychopathic personality to be sitting in the audience of a comedy show, willing somebody to fail and willing somebody not to be funny. What sort of reaction do you get then when you take your show to the Edinburgh Festival and you're doing your show? What sort of reaction do you get? First of all,
to be honest,
from the crowd as you're doing it, but then also afterwards as well.
Well, before, sometimes I get a lot of hesitance. People think that I'm making fun at the expense of people with eating disorders. And that's absolutely not the point. There's a difference between joking about something and joking around it. And I'm kind of trying to use comedy in order to, entertain, but also inform and educate people. And when you're doing it, the reaction is genuinely quite beautiful, because you get everything from people vigorously nodding. You get everything from people who desperately want to laugh and associate with that. But the reactions that I love the most are the people that you just wouldn't expect that come up to you, perhaps and I don't mean to be offensive here, but blokey lads who you wouldn't normally associate with talking about eating disorders. Big muscle heads coming up and go, you know what, mate, I actually really struggle with binge eating or, with muscle dysmorphia. That's really good of you. And that's what's really lovely, is how it doesn't matter what class, colour, creed, background you are, everybody likes to laugh. And I think there's so many interventions that are things like yoga and mindfulness, which is great if you're a Waitrose shopping, hummus dipping, Prosecco loving, middle class liberati, but I ain't. And I think that's what's really nice about comedy, is that it's a leveller.
Are you allowed to joke about it because you've lived it? Is that the difference?
I think there is a big part of ownership. Like, if I joked about what it's been like being a Canadian single mother, you'd be like, what's he know? And if Catherine Ryan did it, then you'd understand, she is a Canadian single mother. So I think ownership really, really comes into it. And I also think as well, what is your intent behind the joke? Are you looking to laud people up? Are you looking to celebrate the underdog? Or are you looking to belittle and bully? And that's got to come into it too.
So go on then. Right. We can't let you go without asking, what would be your tips? So if you're doing a course on how to be a stand-up comic, what sort of advice would you give people?
Well, my piece of advice would be, we're doing it for absolutely free in conjunction with the University of Kent, and it's been funded by the British Academy, so it's absolutely free to everyone. If you want to get in touch, it's info@davechawner.co.uk. And my biggest piece of advice would be, if you want to do it, absolutely go for it. A, you're only going to regret it, and B, I honestly believe that people are made funny, not born funny. So you will be brilliant if you want to do it.
Do you think this sort of thing actually is we talk about how the NHS, I mean, you talk about whether it's underfunded, whether it could maybe use its finances better. However you come at it, a lot of talk about the NHS all comes down to money and, the expense of treatments and drugs and all that sort of stuff. Is this a good way for the NHS nationally to be able to deal with this? Is it a kind of a cost-effective way of helping people take back their own health, really?
Oh, absolutely. This is actually one of the main things about the course, because instead of having one person in a room doing psychotherapy, you have 10 to 15 people doing it all remotely, which means that you can roll this out across the UK. But not only that, because the costs are kept intentionally low, it means that it can be really low cost and high impact in the way that other things that I've mentioned earlier on, for example, yoga and art therapy, not to put those down at all, but you've got materials, you've got resources, whereas with stand-up, you just need a room, some chairs, and a lot of enthusiasm. So that's entirely the point, is when things are really difficult in the NHS at the moment, in order to harness that power of comedy, like people like Joe Brand as a mental health nurse, Harry Hill as a doctor, Paul Sinner, who used to work in psychotherapy, all use to pass on those skills to other people. And I think by doing that, we'll engage more people, get them earlier rather than waiting for them to get ill before they get treatment, and then that saves money in the long term.
What about people who, I mean, I don't know how tricky it is to get an official diagnosis. So getting in there before it's, before you've hit that stage, because as you said, if you're looking at weights and people thinking, well, I'm not skinny enough, I'm not light enough, I don't weigh, like the weight of a feather or, whatever. So this can't possibly be happening to me. But if you get in there early enough, then you can maybe turn that tide.
Absolutely. Well, everything that I do selfishly is aimed at the 16-year-old me. What did I need when I was 16? And I needed someone to inform me that I never forget. Someone once told me something I thought was beautiful. They said, you can just as much drown in a puddle as you can in a lake. It's not to do with size, it's to do with impact. And that's exactly what this is aimed at, of teenage boys, girls, trans, no matter what background, getting them engaged in mental health, not necessarily mental illness, and saying, look, the brain is an organ. You've got to look after your body. You've got physical health. You've got mental health. If you have a brain, you have mental health. So we're not sure about Boris Johnson, but for everyone else, we know that they have a brain, so we know they have to look after it.
Do you think in this world of, the post-COVID world of Zoom and all that sort of stuff, that actually maybe this is a bit easier to get these courses up and running, to get things going like this, to connect people? You're not having to wait for a service in your local area. You're not waiting for, something that's a support group that's going to be running at your local village hall, for example, you can connect with people who can help you all around the country.
I couldn't agree more, Vicky, because I think that there's so many reasons. One is there's never been a better time for mental health. With all of the shocking, horrendous, terrible stats, it's really important to remember we are getting better. If you look at 10 years ago, there wasn't the awareness, there wasn't the openness. We wouldn't have had this conversation. But equally, people are more comfortable with Zoom now, and you can do this course whether you're in Somerset or whether you're in Shetland, and you can connect with those people, which is amazing. And also, one of the few good things about the pandemic is we've actually started to talk about mental health in a real world way. In the same way that people go, oh, I'm doing couch to 10K. You might say, oh, yeah, I'm doing this to look after my mental health. And if there is a silver lining in such a terrible time, I think that's got to be at least it.
Obviously, if people are listening to you and thinking, this resonates with me and I can see myself in this, that's absolutely brilliant. But what is probably more likely is that people might be listening and thinking, I know somebody who I think is like that. And the difficulty of, well, what do you say to them? As somebody who has been through it, what would you have wanted people to say to you, to do, interventions, whatever? What would you have wanted, and what is the best thing to do if you think somebody else is going through this?
So I think the best thing to say is exactly what my old man said to me. I'll never forget, I was diagnosed as severely clinical anorexic on the 22nd of September 2012, so just before Christmas. And I spent Christmas at my mum and dad's. Obviously a festival of food, it was all around. And people have been tiptoeing around the subject. And I'll never forget, my mum went upstairs to have a bath and I was there with my dad. And he looked at me and he went, I'll be honest, Dave, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I've never had an eating disorder. So if we do anything wrong or say anything wrong, please let us know, because it doesn't come from a place of wanting to harm. It comes from a place of wanting to help. And that was one of the most amazing things anyone could ever say, because it accepted that I might not understand why I'm doing this myself. And I tell you what, if I did understand why I was doing it, I would have stopped long ago. And if anyone is worried, you've got BEAT, which is the UK's eating disorder charity, and their website's beateatingdisorders.org.uk. You've also got the Hub of Hope, which is the UK's biggest mental health database, and it uses the geolocation on your phone to tell you what specific types of help is around you, whether that's charities, community groups, NHS support, as well as national support on there as well. So don't be scared to have that conversation. If you are coming at it from a loving place and you want to understand, chances are you ain't going to say the wrong thing.
Dave, you're brilliant. I hope the course goes well, and I'm sure you will help an awful lot of people.
Thank you so much, Vicky. And if anyone does want to get in touch, info@davechawner.co.uk. And all you have to be is over 18 and have a history of an eating disorder, whether that's undiagnosed or not, and we'd love to hear from you.
Dave, thank you ever so much. Dave Chawner, a stand-up comic, went through the battle with anorexia himself as a teenager and into his 20s. He's setting up this course. It is called Comedy for Coping. It's for anybody who has a diagnosed or undiagnosed eating disorder. If you want to find out more, do feel free to get in touch. We have all the details here.